Our scripture this morning comes from 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, and then verses 12 through 19, the NRSV. Okay, lots of funky Hebrew in this again. Let us see if I am up to the challenge. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal-Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the ark. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. It was told King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among all the people. The whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
You're not like other ministers I know. I hear that a lot. Sometimes it's meant as a compliment. Sometimes it's not. I think part of it may have to do with me not growing up in the church. I wasn't familiar with church culture. And some say that maybe my ignorance of church culture is what has kept me going for 25 years of ordained ministry. And then other people say that lack of understanding makes them wonder how I lasted even 5 years. But here we are. Now, one of the first things I learned about church and about church culture are how many sides there are. And I'm not talking multifaceted sides like diversity and things like that. I'm talking about how things in the church sometimes boil down to being on one side of an issue or another side of an issue. And so one of the first things that I learned about church culture is the worship wars. And that's one of those sided issues too, because on one side you have the question about hymns or choruses. And you have contemporary or traditional or quiet and seated or loud and dancing. So the contemporary loud and dancing people, or at least the folks who prefer that, love this passage that Mary read this morning. They love it because it's foundational to their belief. And this story takes place early on in King David's reign. For those of you who have been going along in Bible study and studying this with us, this is very early on in King David's reign. He managed to unite the 12 tribes of Israel after the chaos of being under Saul's rule. And remember, the reason why we had Saul is that Israel demanded a king because they wanted to be like all the other nations. Even when God told them, no king, they demanded one anyway, and God said, okay, fine. But you realize that if you're going to be like all the other nations, you're going to have problems like all the other nations. And pretty soon it became very evident that King Saul would have to be ousted, or else Israel was going to collapse before it even got a chance to get off the ground. So fortunately, God chose David ahead of time, so in order to replace Saul when Israel finally was just about ready to collapse. So when David finally became king, he started setting up his capital in Jerusalem, which was a pretty smart idea because none of the 12 tribes really knew much about Israel, so it was a neutral territory, and that was great. So the first thing he did to set up this capital was to dust off the Ark of the Covenant. So let's have a little recap of the Ark of the Covenant for those of you who haven't seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, okay? The Ark of the Covenant was a gold-covered chest that symbolized the presence of God among the Israelites, okay? It was built while Moses and the people of Israel were still wandering in the wilderness after they had been freed from slavery in Egypt. And so when they actually got into the Promised Land, they came to the conclusion that the ark was the throne from which God commanded the heavenly armies. And they came to this conclusion because when they went into battle with the ark, they won. Except when they didn't, and it's complicated, okay? We're not going to go there this morning. Because the important thing to know is that back in 1 Samuel 4 through 6, the ark was captured by the Philistines, who gave it back to the Israelites. They gave it right back when all these weird Raiders of the Lost Ark things started happening to them. So they didn't want any part of it. So what Israel did is they took it to a little town called Baal, Judah. And King David, that's where King David went and brought that back to Jerusalem. He brought the ark back to Jerusalem so that this ark could have a permanent home instead of being carried around all over the Promised Land like a good luck charm when they went into battle. So David was determined to give the ark and ultimately God the respect it deserved. And that's why we've got this elaborate parade with 30,000 men carrying the ark and making animal sacrifices every 6 paces. It was a big deal. The ark had never had a permanent home, but now it will. You know how people tell me you aren't like other ministers I know? David got that too. You aren't like other kings we know. But that was a good thing, right? Remember, that was a really good thing because God didn't want David to be like all the other kings. David was somebody who ruled differently than all the other kings. Because, you know, God didn't want the people of Israel to have a garden variety ancient Middle Eastern king. That was Saul. That's who Saul was, and things really didn't end well for him. So God chose David because he led his people more like a shepherd than a king. In other words, God appreciated David because he wasn't like all the other kings. He wasn't like a typical king. Now, you want to know something that other kings didn't do that David did? They didn't dance around in underwear that only priests were allowed to wear when they brought the symbol of the presence of God into their capital cities. And yet, here is David doing that. Now, I see the look of concern in some of your eyes. Jesse started out the sermon by saying he isn't like other ministers. And now he's talking about David, who isn't like other kings, and somehow dancing in your underwear is on the table. I'm not going there. I'll just tell you right now, not going there. Have faith. The reason why the dancing and the owl worship people like this passage so much is so that they can say, see, David here is, David is dancing exuberantly before the Lord, and, who is to say that that's a bad thing? This is a good thing. He was honoring God. There is even a song that we sing up at camp about this. It's called Undignified. If you've ever been a counselor up at camp or been up to camp, we sing this song called Undignified that basically said, I'm going to dance and be crazy when I worship because that's how David honored God. But remember what I said about churches having sides? So David might be the hero for the I prefer dancing and shouting when I worship folks, but you can bet that the I prefer quiet and contemplative worship people have a hero too. You want to take a guess who the hero is in this story for them? Michal. Right, Michal. David's first wife and the daughter of that terrible King Saul, who almost ruined everything for Israel. That's Michal. She often gets cast as the nagging wife who's embarrassed because David was dancing frivolously in his priestly underwear. Now, I think there's way more to this story than that. But so what I want to do is I want to get that image of Michal as the nagging wife just off the table right now, because she does not deserve to get cast as the villain in this story. And no, I'm not going to start preaching a dance has no place in the worship kind of sermon either. Let's just clean the slate. Let's just get all of that off the table and pretend like there are no issues here in today's lesson. When I was preparing today's sermon, I read some really good articles by a guy named Walter Brueggemann and a woman named Wilda Gaffney about how this story is the beginning of King David's struggle with being good king and bad king all at the same time. And this is something that would follow him throughout his entire reign. Because on one hand, this is the David who is doing everything and being everything that he should be. Last week when we talked about how David cares for Israel like a shepherd, here he is being a good example to his flock by worshiping God extravagantly and with all of his strength. He is actually putting God first in this new kingdom that he's establishing, which is something that King Saul never did at all. He failed to do that, and that's where David was a better king. What David is doing is wonderful. No one can doubt this. Here he is, being a good king. So you might be thinking, okay, but how is this story about David being a bad king too? Well, this is where Michal comes into the picture. Part of the reason why David is such a great king is because of things that Michal did. Get this. This is something that I didn't think about until I read and fact-checked. But Michal is the only woman in this whole history of Israel section that we've been going through, Judges through 2nd Chronicles, who is described as one who loves another man, who says it out loud. She's the only woman who ever explicitly said, I love David. But that love is never returned. See, David would have rotted in Saul's prison if Michal hadn't helped him escape. She defied her own father. She lied to her own father in order to save David's life. She helped David overthrow her father so that David could be king. She cast her lot with David instead of her own father. Think about that. Think about that. Does she really detest David because of that dance? See, I believe that the reason Michal despises David is that after all she's done for him, and what are his actions? After taking and using her love to escape and ultimately succeed her father on the throne, David has moved on to other women, other children. He will not return to her bed. He will not father children for her. She became a living widow as she watched him woo, seduce, impregnate other women all around her. Michal was retrieved like property rather than being rescued to the loving embrace of the man that she once loved. David is alive because of her. But during that whole conflict between David and Saul, she became just a pawn between two powerful men. And now David's coming back to Jerusalem with the ark, saying it's all God. It's all God that's doing this. And Michal's thinking, yeah, but I helped to do some of this too. You had this great procession with the ark, and you're coming here with all your wives and your servants and all the things that make you look like a good king. But if it wasn't for me, you'd still be in Saul's prison. And sure, you can give all the credit to God. That's perfectly good. That's fair. But don't I deserve some recognition too? And I don't think this is her saying, ooh, celebrate me, as much as it is her saying, yes, celebrate God. That's great. That's fine. Celebrate God through the ark. It's good that you're bringing the ark to Jerusalem, but could you celebrate God for what God has done through me to save your life so that you can sit on that throne? And this isn't a competition between God and Michal either. This isn't even Michal is jealous of God. This is Michal is getting tired of being treated like property. I knew a guy once who worked for me at a camp that I managed in Virginia one summer. He grew up in the region's youth and camping program. He was friendly, he was outgoing, he was social, he loved his friends loved him, but he was uncertain about this whole God thing. And that's okay. He grew up in the church, and he had this solid relationship, or at least a foundation to build a solid relationship with God. But like a lot of young adults, he needed to figure out some things for himself. But unfortunately, when he went off to college, he developed an opioid addiction. And thankfully, he found a group of sober Christian young men who took him in, nurtured him, and led him into faith in Jesus. But he took it a little further than most do, and became so into Jesus that he started alienating the people in his life, including the people who had planted the seeds of faith in him in the first place. His pastor, his friends, his family, his camp friend, his camp's family. And when he came to camp looking for a summer job, I hired him. But while he was there, he made sure everybody knew how into Jesus he was. He was even critical of other Christians who didn't seem to be as into Jesus as he was. And he became one of the contemporary dancing in the aisle Christians who looked down on others who preferred a quieter, more contemplative faith. Was he sincere? Hey, who am I to judge? He seemed sincere. His words and his practices indicated that he loved Jesus. He made sure everybody saw him up on the hill reading his Bible in the morning and praying over his meals and everything like that. His relationship with God seemed great. But he disregarded his human relationships, and that didn't seem good at all. And unfortunately, eventually, he slipped back in to drugs He stole $80 from the camp store, and we never saw him again. And I often wondered whether his extravagant displays of faith were all about God, or were they all about him? When David brought the ark into Jerusalem, I have no doubt that he was sincere about his relationship with God, and that he wanted other people to see that he was the priestly shepherd king that God called him to be. But I also think he dismissed and disregarded some of the very important human relationships that he had, and this became a pattern in his life that would eventually lead to his downfall. Folks, for sure, put God first. Yes. Dance before the Lord. Please dance before. You can do that here. You really can. I'm not going to judge. Love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your might, just like it says in the law of Moses. But remember what Jesus added to that. And love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, don't disregard your human relationships in pursuit of your relationship with God. God knows your heart. You don't need to prove the sincerity of your faith to anyone else, especially if it's someone who may have helped you become who you are right now.